Good afternoon, everyone in Europe. Good morning to our friends in the US. My name is Ville Sinkkonen. I'm a leading researcher here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, affectionately known as FIA. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the first Transatlantic Currents webinar of 2026, which is called One Year of Trump 2.0, Looking Back, Looking Forward. This event is hosted by FIA's Center on US Politics and Power, or CUSP. The first year of Donald Trump's second term in the White House has been marked by profound changes in numerous areas of US foreign and defense policy. Trump has utilized transactional and America First approaches in matters ranging from trade to military conflict resolution. His general distrust of long-standing alliances and multilateral institutions actually stand in stark contrast with Republican and Democratic predecessors since World War II. Unlike his first term, Trump has cut back the national security structure, and he now operates with a small handful of senior officials who echo his public rhetoric and carry out his policy swings. Domestically, the administration has used executive orders and other decisions that not only bypass Congress, but also challenge accepted legal practices and societal norms. Some developments, for example, in immigration policy, were telegraphed during the campaign, are actually quite popular with Trump's base, but they've been carried out with questionable legal basis. This has also meant multiple legal challenges for the administration. Meanwhile, opinion polls show significant public disappointment with administration policies regarding the economy and healthcare in particular. And we're actually beginning to see some cracks within the Make America Great Again, or MAGA, coalition as the 2026 midterm elections draw near. With that introduction, this webinar takes stock of Trump's first year and also takes a look into the future. And to do this, we've assembled a wonderful group of valued FIA colleagues, whom I will now very briefly introduce. Maria Lindén is a research fellow here at FIA at the Center on US Politics and Power. Her current research focuses on the crisis of liberal democracy in the present-day United States, especially electoral manipulation. Welcome, Maria. Ambassador Deborah McCarthy is a non-resident fellow at FIA and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. She's had an illustrious career as a diplomat, most recently as the US negotiator to the United Nations Ad Hoc Committee on Cybercrime from 2022 to 2025. And Deborah has also served as the US ambassador to Lithuania from 2013 to 2016. I hope I got that right. And finally, Leo Michel is a non-resident senior fellow at FIA and also at the Atlantic Council. He's most recently held government positions at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, the Office of Secretary of Defense, and as Deputy US Representative to the US-Russia Bilateral Consultative Commission. So we have a great panel to help us make sense of the turmoil in US domestic and international policy. What we'll do today is that we'll start with domestic politics. I will give our speakers an opportunity to shed light on the state of domestic institutions and American democracy, among other important questions, and we'll then segue into foreign and security policy and consider the changes to US global engagement. And after that, I will let each of our panelists engage in some forecasting, and then we'll move into the Q&A section of this webinar. And for that, you have the chat function in Teams, and you can start writing your questions into the chat function right away. I will then collect the questions and address them to our panelists. With that, let's start with domestic politics first. This administration has been especially adept at doing things fast and flooding the zone with a breathtaking amount of policies, but also a breathtaking amount of noise. Now, in the midst of all of this action, what should we really be paying attention to? I think that's a question that's on everyone's minds currently. And let's start with Deborah. What should we be zeroing in on?
Well, thank you, Ville, and thank you for having us on this webinar at this important moment where all eyes are not on just the U.S., but on what's going to happen in Davos in terms of foreign policy. And I'm going to weave a little bit what I think we should pay attention to with a little bit of forecasting. Obviously, as you noted, we expect to see a continued heavy use of executive orders to shape not only the structure of government, but public policy in a wide swath of areas. And using the tactic of flooding the zone. EOs, as you all know, are not laws. They're easily overturned. And it's interesting to note that the Trump administration is making very little effort, despite a majority in Congress, to put any of this major change into legacy legislature. So we need to watch that in the future, because some of these will not have major impact. The other element that, as you note, Ville, which is the continued bypassing of Congress, although I note there's some cracks there, and the recent vote in the Senate on the war powers and Venezuela is, I think, significant, though obviously it's not seeing the light of day as a piece of legislation. We should expect also the continued use of the Department of State as literally the law firm for the president. And that is going to have a lasting legacy because it's been seen pretty much as a professional organization that stood apart and upheld our national laws. And then we can also see the continued use of the courts, i.e. by the Trump administration. I'm not talking about opposition, with his favorite, which is emergency appeals to the Supreme Court to reinforce some of the executive orders. But that doesn't mean there's not action in return. And I note that during President Trump's first term, 246 court cases challenged his administration's use of executive power, and he only won, or his team only won 22% of them. We have at least 33 attempts to push back on his initial 228 executive orders. And of course, we're all watching some of the monumental decisions coming down, which affect Europe in particular, but the world, which is his use of IEPA. And that's imminent, coming down any day soon. Of course, the administration will reimpose some tariffs somehow using 301 authority or other authorities. So they're not going to give up, but the process is much more seemingly more transparent and slower. But we're also seeing pushback by civil society, states, individual groups, and to some extent, and beginning and to watch, is more forceful statements on the part of U.S. companies and the private sector. They are finally beginning to express their concerns, mostly related recently to attempts to push out Chairman Powell, but others on the state of the economy. And given, his low approval rate on his handling of the economy, we should see probably more coming from the private sector. And then I'll wrap up by just saying we need to watch the information space. There'll be continued efforts by the administration to shape the information space, and doing it two ways. One is dismantling, belittling, or attacking, let's say, media that's seen as liberal. And we've seen a number of steps taken in that. Obviously, reducing the access of the media to government agencies, the White House, the Department of Defense, and then we've also seen the use of lawsuits. But another element is they have begun already to limiting the amount of information available on government websites, not only on actions taken, but even on treasure troves of research data that existed for the civil society, academia, and others to use. And there's a wall going up on that, concurrent with the use of interesting ads issued by certain agencies, notably DHS. But then a second element of this is allying with conservative media to amplify the administration's policies and attack and help and use them to attack perceived enemies, both institutional and personal. And that's something also to watch as we go forward. And I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. There's a lot of things there to pick up on. One that I can attest to as a researcher is the difficulty of finding information on American government websites, which has certainly made doing the basic work of researchers more difficult. And of course, that goes for the voting citizen, the voting public as well. Leo, What is your take? What should we be looking at currently?
Well, to follow up on Deborah's remarks, I think it's very useful to look at the Trump administration's approach to immigration policy, because it really does demonstrate its departure from established jurisprudence, from practices, and most importantly, really norms and traditions. And developments in this area over the past year might be shocking to many, but they should really not be surprising. And just to briefly look back from his announcement of his candidacy in 2015 to his first term in the White House and later as a candidate for re-election in 2020 and 2024, Mr. Trump and his close advisors have made very clear their underlying attitude towards immigrants, especially undocumented migrants coming across the southern border. In their words, not mine, in their words, they describe these people as invaders, vermin, rapists, murderers pushed out of prisons and insane asylums, and various what they called shithole countries. They promised to build a wall against the entire, across the entire southern border. And in the televised presidential and vice presidential debates in 2024, both Trump and J.D. Vance, who was running for vice president, repeated lies on the internet that Haitian immigrants in Ohio were stealing and eating the pet dogs of their white neighbors. So that is recent history. So what's happened over the past year? Well, to dramatically reshape immigration-related policies, and Deborah mentioned that there have been some 228 executive orders signed over the past year. 38 of those have direct or significant indirect effects on immigration and the day-to-day lives of the estimated 14 million undocumented immigrants living in the US. The administration has virtually shut down access to asylum and refugee resettlement programs, especially along the southern border, although they made an exception and have welcomed white so-called refugees from South Africa. They've terminated temporary legal protections for over, well, I would say nearly 2 million persons. They've suspended for many thousands the granting of permanent residence, temporary US citizenships. And as Europeans know, international students and some foreign officials have been denied entry for expressing political opinions that may be critical of the Trump administration on social media. Now, the administration has focused its efforts on deportations. They are expanding the detention facilities in the United States to hold up to 80,000 persons. The Republican-dominated Congress has inundated the Department of Homeland Security and its border security and detention and deportation systems with an additional $170 billion in spending. And many federal agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Internal Revenue Service, the Drug Enforcement Agency, have had to redirect thousands of their personnel to support immigration tasks. This has included, especially in the case of ICE, the Immigration Control Enforcement, they've conducted large-scale raids, which have led to widespread and credible charges of using excessive, sometimes deadly force, not only against immigrants, but also against US citizens that are caught up in the web. As Deborah mentioned, there has been pushbacks, incidents of pushback. A number of states, local governments, non-government coalitions, and so forth, affected individuals have sought legal protection in the courts. They've often won at the level of the federal district court, which actually considers evidence, hard evidence. There have been instances where the Trump administration has gotten some relief at the appeals level. And I would say the Supreme Court, with very few exceptions, it's a mixed picture, but with very few exceptions, they've really not rebutted the major assault done by the administration. And we're waiting to see now an important case that will be argued soon, and that is a Trump executive order that is attempting to end a 150-year-old constitutional guarantee that persons born in the United States are, with very few exceptions, American citizens. Looking ahead a little bit, on the one hand, I think there's little to suggest that Trump and his closest advisor, or most of his Republican allies in Congress and the media, have really any inclination to moderate their statements or their actions. And just look at their reaction to the very recent shooting that's been highly publicized, the shooting by an ICE agent of an unarmed woman in Minneapolis under highly questionable circumstances. On the other hand, there are growing signs of public discomfort, outright opposition to the administration's rhetoric and actions. Not a massive outpouring in the streets yet, but it's beginning, mostly in the so-called blue states and municipalities, meaning those where there are Democrat mayors, Democratic governors. Minnesota, once again, is a case. Business associations have become more outspoken in their concerns about losing foreign-born labor, both skilled and unskilled, and they're worried about the declining foreign interest in tourism and pursuing higher education in the US. And recognizing, I'll conclude with this, recognizing that others may well disagree with my judgment here, I personally remain very concerned that the administration's conduct in this area is and will continue to do serious and long-lasting damage to American soft power around the globe. And this will not be easily or quickly repaired.
It's an important viewpoint, Leo. A quick addendum to this is of course, you mentioned that there's some pushback. I mean, how close are we to a tipping point in this regard, where this becomes the defining issue that sort of starts chipping away at Trump's power?
I don't think we've reached the tipping point yet. I can just tell you, broadly speaking, public opinion polls have shown now that while perhaps a majority of Americans want some kind of more strict enforcement in general terms, in principle, of immigration laws, and would like to see fewer undocumented immigrants in this country, there is a majority now that says that the tactics employed by this administration are wrong. And that majority seems to be growing every week. And incidents, as I mentioned, this tragic shooting, some would call it a homicide, that occurred in Minneapolis, and I'm afraid it probably won't be the last. That is doing something to crystallize public opinion, even among some in the Republican ranks. Generally, though, when Republicans are polled, a majority still strongly supports the president's policies and actions in this area.
Thank you, Leo, for that assessment. We'll go to Maria, and I have an inkling that we'll hear something about the state of liberal democracy and institutions in the United States, but we will see. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you, Ville. Yes, as a democracy scholar, the viewpoint that I wanted to offer as one suggestion on what to focus on what to care about, is all the different ways that Trump and his administration have been dismantling, discrediting ways to hold those in power accountable. In a well-functioning liberal democracy, there are several different types of accountability mechanisms that are designed to keep those in power in check. There's accountability among equals. In the case of the US, that would be the separation of powers between the presidency, the courts, and Congress. Trump has been actively seeking to grab power, basically, both from Congress and the courts. We still haven't seen if there may be like this big showdown in the end between him and the courts, or between him and Congress. So far, it's been more of a boiling frog effect, where the other co-equal branches of government have been letting him do as he wishes, more or less. As Leo mentioned, in the case of the courts, we haven't seen that much pushback from the Supreme Court, even though lower courts have sided with opponents of Trump's power grabs. So it remains to be seen if in the end someone in these co-equal branches will really try and hold him accountable, but so far that's not, there's not that much reason for optimism. Then there's the rest of the society outside of the government, the free press, academia, all kinds of institutions that rely on freedom of speech to be the watchdog or to be a critical voice in times when it's needed. These institutions are also all under attack from the Trump administration. He has been trying to control academia, what they get to research, how they get to talk about certain things. He has retaliated against a lot of media companies and individual journalists. Recently, there was a raid at a journalist's home where some of her electronics were seized under the pretext, it feels, of an investigation into a certain different person. But once the government has all of this person's laptops, she had been covering government related issues, and there's a lot of other people that she has spoken to that have nothing to do with the investigation, but who might now be in danger because the government can now find out her sources. A lot of things are happening that seem to be direct attempts to make both journalists and their sources afraid to speak up against the Trump administration. Then, of course, there's the citizens, the mechanisms that are there in place for the citizens to do something if they are not happy with their elected leaders. There's the freedom to protest, the freedom to speak out, and of course voting. The opportunity at the next election to say, no, we want something different. We don't like this government, these people. And Trump is all the time doing things that are attempts to tilt the electoral playing field in his party's favor. I would still say that right now I'm optimistic that the midterm elections will be free and fair enough for there to be a realistic chance for the Democratic Party to gain seats and possibly take over the House or even perhaps the Senate. It's not that rigged yet, but it wouldn't be possible. But it's getting more and more difficult as Trump does things that tilt the playing field further and further. And of course, there's this element of fear that Leo was also talking about with regards to immigration. Some American citizens are scared to even leave the house because they might be mistaken for an illegal immigrant by somebody profiling them on the basis of how they look and how they talk and where they work. And they might face a terrible fate at the hands of these people, despite being law-abiding American citizens. I've heard that some people are scared to leave the country for fear of getting into difficulties at the border, despite being American citizens. For example, based on things that they have said, spoken out against the government and such, or if their work has to do with topics that the current administration doesn't agree with, such as minority rights or other ways to make less represented groups be heard in society. So this element of fear is also a factor that can make people less inclined to go and vote, or it can make them less inclined to protest, to speak out, to join a movement that is trying to counterbalance Trump's illiberal actions or trying to make him accountable. So all these different things, they have this common thread of trying to, well, make him king, basically. Make him someone who doesn't have to worry about being held accountable by anyone. Thank you.
I was going to go straight into foreign and security policy, but actually, since you brought up the midterms, I'm actually going to use this opportunity to ask all of you for a very sort of brief analysis of what the likely outcome of the midterms in your view is, and what that would then entail. I mean, what kinds of opportunities would that give to the Democratic Party, for instance, to push back against Trump's agenda? Like really brief answers on this, and I guess we could start with Maria, then go to Leo, and then to Deborah.
Okay, well, as I said, I think there is a realistic chance still for the Democrats to gain either the House or the Senate or both. I think they need to focus on the affordability message to do so, to make it clear that they're the ones who care about whether people have enough money to survive their daily existence. And if they do make gains, I think the biggest problem is that even though they can investigate Trump, they can even impeach him, but I don't think they're going to have a sufficient majority to overcome the supermajoritarian requirements. They're not going to have enough people, unless some moderate Republicans side with them, to pass new legislation that goes directly against Trump. And even if they did, Trump doesn't care about the existing laws. He keeps finding loopholes. He keeps just breaking things and making people sue him. And unless the Supreme Court really steps up as an ally to the pro-democratic movement, not even passing new laws is going to help, in my opinion.
Okay. Leo, go ahead. What's your take?
Well, in terms of predicting outcomes, I have to say I'm not very good at it, but so I won't go there. But a couple of things strike me that are different with regard to the atmosphere in Congress and the way people may be campaigning. One is, it is interesting, and it's still anecdotal, but it's interesting that at least 3 or 4 senators have spoken in a quite disturbing way about their concerns about personal security. And what they hear from their colleagues, who will say privately that they don't agree with the president's policy on such and such a matter. I'm speaking of Republican senators, but they're afraid to say something publicly because of concerns about public safety. And even a very staunch backer of Mr. Trump for years now, who is Marjorie Taylor Greene, resigned earlier this month her seat in the House of Representatives. A very, very right-wing, very ultra-conservative person. And one of the reasons she did that was she cited threats to her personal and her family's security that were generated by a public spat that she had with President Trump over a few of his policies and the behavior of his Department of Justice in the Epstein files situation. This is something new. It's something very disturbing that if candidates or members of the House, members of the Senate are slanting their statements because of concerns over their personal security of a mean tweet or a posting on Truth Social coming from the president. This is quite extraordinary and quite troubling for the democratic norms that we have observed for hundreds of years.
That's an extremely concerning development in a democracy, obviously. Deborah, very briefly, and then we'll move on to foreign and security policy.
Sure, I'll be brief. Looking at the statistics, it's going to be a heavier lift for the Democrats than it is going to be in the Senate than it is going to be in the House. In the Senate, they need to get a net of 4 seats. That's a very heavy lift. Whereas in the House, they need to get a net of 3 seats, much more feasible despite, redistricting, et cetera. They're battling for the space of using the term affordability, which touches all Americans, as they feel they cannot afford their standards of living. And there's much more discipline on the Republican side than there is on the Democratic side. The Democratic Party is still looking for its new mission in life and in the future. So therefore, even if, let's say, the House flips to the Democrats, unlikely in the Senate, but again, I'm not a domestic numbers, professional here. There could be gridlock, obviously, and the president will continue, as Maria is saying, to use executive orders to seek to continue to transform both government and, as I said, civil society. But I note by then, his time is limited. He's on the descent. He cannot run again. He's over 80 years old, and we will see what happens in that space. And last but not least, I received yesterday, and I mentioned it to my FIA colleagues, a list of the groups that have just exploded on the civil society side to work on the elections to ensure they're transparent, that people go, that people don't feel intimidated, working with judges, working with police, working with law enforcement, and not just election, monitors, etc. So that's a good sign. That's a good sign. There'll be a lot more vigilance, let's say, this time on the whole process. The unknown is the information space. How one side is going to use the information space to distort what is actually happening in an election and the results, et cetera. We've seen that game done before. And whether new and different media that have emerged in the last year and a half will be able to, push back and get some messages out that are correct.
Thank you, Deborah. With that ray of hope for democracy, I would say, let's turn to foreign policy questions. So we're maybe going from constraining power, possibly, to using power in a spectacular fashion in the past few weeks. And Deborah, of course, you have a long background in Latin American questions. You've worked on Venezuela, you've worked on Nicaragua. And the Trump administration has certainly shown that it's willing to use military force in its own hemisphere to secure US interests in a manner that this administration perceives them. Obviously, the capture of Nicolas Maduro a couple of weeks ago, it was militarily a successful operation, but rested on dubious domestic and international legal grounds. In the national security strategy, the administration refers to the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which has since been rebranded as the Donroe Doctrine by Trump. So what is going on in the Western Hemisphere, and what are the possible implications for the US's global role more generally?
Sure, it's hard to put all this into a short presentation here. I think it's important to recognize that this shift to the Western Hemisphere, as clearly outlined in the NSS, is a permanent one for the balance of the administration. They attempted in Trump 1 to focus on the Western Hemisphere, but limited actions to building a wall, working to some extent on immigration, the trade agreement, renegotiating the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. But this time, the interests have broadened. The NSS is clear. It's fighting narco-terrorists, transnational organized crime, reducing hostile ownership of assets in the region, and I'll address that later, increasing U.S. access to strategic locations otherwise undefined, and obviously U.S. commercial opportunities, the so-called Trump corollary. And the tools being used have broadened beyond what they've used before in Trump 1 and starting out to use in Trump 2, sanctions, visa cancellations, tariffs, cutbacks in foreign assistance. They've added a couple of other tools. Going after commercial deals and instructing absolutely every embassy to work top priority to get the deals and to push the Chinese out. And to military tools, the NSS is really clear, calling for increased military presence in the region. We don't have many bases. Targeted deployments, including, quote, the use of lethal force to address issues such as fighting drugs, crime, and immigration. And the most recent was the incursion into Venezuela. Now, the Monroe Doctrine has been used for everything since it was first written up as a message to Congress. It's not law. It's been used for interference at the turn of the century. It's been used for a good neighbor policy. So this is but, a new incarnation on it. But as we see, the firm determination of the Trump administration to assert its dominance in the region. We saw in the beginning going after Panama And even though that's quieted down as the legal debate on the transfer of two concessions at the port continues both in China and in Panama, my guess is this is going to resurface. And also we saw the actions of Venezuela and on international waters to blow up small drug trafficking boats. I mean, they're not boats, they're not even ships. And then finally, I think it's important to look at this effort on Greenland in the context of the focus on the Western Hemisphere. Greenland is in the Western Hemisphere. And oddly enough, when the Monroe Doctrine was issued, Greenland was already a territory of Denmark, and the Monroe Doctrine calls for the US not interfering in existing colonies. So, but I think this emphasis in the Western Hemisphere is going to face some harsh realities, which is one, the Chinese have made great inroads on trade, on investment. And US companies are reluctant to go south. We found this in different administrations. Corruption issues, small projects versus the big projects in the Middle East, and bad payment records in the region, and also tough competition from Spain, Canada, Australia, and companies coming out of Brazil. So China's seen as a means to more rapidly address the infrastructure gap that there is in the region. And the US it's going to be tough to do catch up. You can't push US American companies, and this is where the president has limited powers to go, and we're seeing it as an example on how many are rushing to go to Venezuela. And the other thing is the US is not leveraging trade agreements. It is not offering trade agreements. Look at the new EU-Mercosur agreement, which is an incredible achievement. And that is something that I think the EU needs to, tout even more. And then also the other element, which is the countries in the region are not what they used to be. I mean, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia and Mexico are now in the OECD. As an example, Brazil is just about there. And also, there's going to be pushback also because the memories of the elites of the years of interference have not disappeared. It's in the fabric of what their political education. And I think the EU can take advantage of this in the following way, which is also voting at the UN. Look at the vote of what the Latin American countries did, or most of them, in the early vote in the Trump administration on a resolution on Ukraine, which, didn't castigate Russia. Every country in the Western Hemisphere abstained. That is leverage for the EU on other issues as well. And I'll stop.
Thanks so much, Deborah. I mean, there would be about 1 million follow-on questions that I would like to ask you on this topic, but being mindful of the time and knowing that our audience is probably also interested in what is happening with respect not only to Greenland, which you mentioned, but also with respect to transatlantic relations and also Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Leo, we've been watching for the past week and a half how Trump is doubling down on annexing Greenland and pushing and actually punishing NATO allies who sent a few soldiers there, not only to support Denmark, but also to signal to the US that they're actually taking Arctic security seriously. And the message, of course, from Europe has been that this acquisition talk is a non-starter and actually risks destabilizing the most successful military alliance in history, and also distracts from the real threat, which is, of course, Russia and its continuing war of aggression in Ukraine. So what is the current state of transatlantic relations, and where do we go from here? What do you see as the prospects? And I will quickly add in the Trump speech in Davos. He has said that he is planning on purchasing Greenland, but he has ruled out the use of military force to annex the territory.
Well, as we've seen with Mr. Trump, his positions can change sometimes on a daily basis with little or no advance notice. But I have some real concerns that given their actions to date, many of which are contradictory, vague, and misleading, could lead us to some very, very catastrophic national security consequences. Let me because there's so much to discuss, I'm going to be selective and just hit a few what I think are key points. And let's start with Ukraine. I do agree with a statement made recently. I may have been in Davos by the NATO Secretary General that we need to keep our eye on what is the most pressing priority for the Western alliance right now, and that is Russia's aggression in Ukraine. I know your president, President Stubb, has laid out certain options that he sees. I tend to be on the pessimistic side. The reason is that if I look back to Mr. Trump's record in his previous administration, there is a constant theme of resentment towards Ukraine leadership in particular, which one should recall his attempt to pressure President Zelensky to dig up and launch an investigation into the son of Joe Biden, who was slated to be his principal opponent at the time. That led to Trump's first of two impeachments by the House of Representatives. I don't think he forgets. During his 4 years out of power, he consistently opposed further military assistance to Ukraine, denigrated the Ukrainian president, and generally said that Ukraine is not worth the trouble it causes with his vision of restoring very good relations and very good economic relations with Russia. So coming into his second term, I think he carried this with him. And there have been ups and downs, but he started, as we know, during the first term with an ambush, really, of President Zelensky in the Oval Office, a cutting off, a suspension of American military assistance and intelligence assistance that lasted a couple of weeks, and really hasn't resumed, I should say, the U.S. assistance granted during the Biden administration. But now he's adopted, in essence, a cash and carry policy. He's happy to sell American weapons to NATO allies and not interfere, at least not yet, in their transfer of arms to Ukraine. Intelligence cooperation reportedly was resumed after a couple of weeks, but the future of that, I think, is very uncertain. And without going into the day-to-day, because there have been so many twists and turns, I just perceive a general trend of an occasional public criticism or a tweet, post that may be critical of Mr. Putin, but on balance, where is the pressure being applied? It seems to be, with one exception, and that is some sanctions on Russian oil companies, which are not complete, by the way. Most of the pressure, it seems to me, has been on Ukraine to make concessions. And I am concerned about one of the scenarios that President Stubb mentioned, and that is that over time, the president decides, I have other priorities, let Ukraine and Russia fight, if they will, and essentially say that this is the European problem. And if Europe cannot stand up to the Russians through military assistance, through the presence of troops, to have a meaningful deterrent, well, then it's Europe that's lost Ukraine, not Donald Trump. I hope I'm wrong in that, but I think there are some signs that point to this. And there's an obvious contradiction in Trump's approach as well. I don't know the specifics that are in the still draft agreements on so-called U.S. security assurances to Ukraine as part of an eventual settlement. But one can ask, what is the value of such assurances if at the same time we see the same administration bullying a NATO ally to acquire its territory? To me, this is kind of a question here. Just a few points on Greenland. Of course, Greenland is a strategic importance, but let's not overplay what Russia or even China, for that matter, are doing in the military sense in the region right now. yes, Russia has over the years improved some of its bases in the Arctic, part of, and it's very important to them strategically, the basing of the Northern Fleet and so forth. But does Russia, or do Russia and China pose a near and present danger to the United States by their activities in and around in Greenland? I think certainly not. At least I haven't seen a case made for this. Now, there is also one misimpression, I think. Commentators, press reporters have noted correctly that there is this 1951 agreement, which grants the United States the ability to do things like construct and install and maintain and operate military bases across Greenland. And I would ask you to post the actual 1951 agreement and the 2004 amendment, which limits the US basing to the one current base, which is a missile defense and satellite or space observation base, if you would post that in the chat. But I would just ask that your audience actually read the agreement, because the agreement is very clear in its language that this agreement is part and parcel of the implementation of the North Atlantic Treaty. And it authorizes, it encourages the two parties to take such measures, I'm quoting from it, as are necessary or appropriate to carry out expeditiously their respective and joint responsibilities in Greenland in accordance with NATO plans. So, in other words, the US-Danish agreement is tied to implementing the North Atlantic Treaty, including the Article 5 collective defense obligation. And it's not really a blank check for the United States to do anything it pleases in Greenland. And I would say certainly the tone, the bullying tone adopted by the president day after day after day would do nothing to encourage, or does little to encourage either Danish or Greenland authorities to take the attitude that, hey, whatever Washington wants or whatever this administration wants, we're prepared to grant. So I am concerned. This points to, I would just say a couple words, this is a broader problem for the alliance. I wrote a paper, you have the link there, Villa, 1 year ago, it was in February of 2025, looking at what I called the rocky road ahead for transatlantic relations. And I asked the question at the end, after mentioning what Mr. Trump's views are and early indications of difficulty, and I mentioned Greenland in that as well. This is a year ago. I asked the question at the end, will the past Greek prelude, will NATO be able to survive the differences that are cropping up on a daily basis? And I left it as a question. I'm not sure it will. I'm not sure that the past will be prelude, where allies were able to overcome their differences because their common interests and common values really remained there. We may be actually approaching, and possibly we're at, a fracture point, as the Canadian Prime Minister said in his very, very good speech yesterday, which I would recommend to your audience. I don't see, in contrast with the first Trump administration, I don't see the adults in the room. Trump's first defense secretary was famous for saying that, reminding us all of an essential truth, and that is that nations with allies prosper, those without allies do not. And we should not only, the US should not only be willing to listen to allies, but we need to be willing to be persuaded by them. Because as he said at the time, not all of the good ideas come from the country with the most aircraft carriers. I was the director for NATO policy in the Pentagon on September 11th, 2001. I saw how quickly our Canadian and our European allies were prepared to respond to an attack on the United States by invoking Article 5, and in subsequent years, doing things to actually put that commitment into practice. And it's highly ironic and highly tragic that one of the countries that, proportionate to its population, paid the highest price in lives and casualties in Afghanistan, but some in Iraq as well, is Denmark. And to see now such disrespectful language used and threats really used towards Denmark and towards the autonomous government, also the authorities in Greenland, is very disheartening. And I can only imagine how Europeans feel privately, even though publicly they are still in many cases, out of necessity, I believe, trying to maintain a restraining tone and looking, they hope, for a diplomatic off-ramp. I hope they succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, for that sobering assessment. I think in the security community's literature, security communities are grounded on four I's: interest, interdependence, institutions, and identities. And each of us can, in our own heads, assess what the current state of the transatlantic relationship is with respect to those four I's. And I think Leo's remarks touch on that extremely well. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Please do write more questions in the chat. We'll try to address as many of them as possible in the coming minutes. So for the speakers, I'm looking for brief answers for this lightning round. So our first question from Mark Duffin. A brief mention was made of America's soft power being diminished by the Trump administration. But would it be reasonable to argue that American soft power has actually been diminishing and even diminished at least since the second Bush administration due to China's BRI initiatives and Europe's increased dislike of the United States? Who wants to take this question?
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Deborah. Yeah.
I would say that the soft power has not been uniformly going down since, in the post-Cold War era. In fact, I think the U.S. built up a number of new soft power tools. But what going ahead, these soft power tools have been dismantled almost completely by the current administration. And by that, I'm not talking about the use of just government institutions to project, but to dismantle all the supporting institutions, some of which were funded by the government, that also projected U.S. values, positions, etc. And then you add on to that the complete dismantling, although few elements remain, of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and particularly the Voice of America. Reform was probably needed within them, but taking all that down and leaving the space open to precisely the Chinese who are creeping in across, Southeast Asia and so forth, in an aggressive push of putting their points of view on local media, and not to speak of what Russia and Russia Today does. But the dismantling of it is probably going to be a long-lasting one, and it's going to be very difficult to rebuild. And when you have also sort of a uniform messaging coming out of administration with little transparency to be the sole source of what the U.S. is all about, that's also dangerous. I would hope that on the private side that some of this is made up for, but we haven't seen that yet.
Thank you, Deborah. Do Leo or Maria want to pitch in on this? If not, there's another question about Ukraine. And I suppose the gist is whether Ukraine can achieve all its objectives and keep all its land without active military intervention from the US military or from European militaries. And I suppose, Leo, you could perhaps offer your reflections on this.
It's amazing what Ukraine has been able to do to defend itself since the full-scale invasion of February 2022. What it's been able to do with its military forces, the adapting of its technology, the resilience of its people, the civilian population has been subject to unmitigated and steadily increasing attacks by drones, by ballistic missiles, on its infrastructure, on civilian housing. And this has been, I don't think their military situation is hopeless at this point at all. They've taken quite a beating, but they've imposed quite a price as well on the Russian aggression. Looking ahead, however, they will need support. They will need support in air and missile defense systems. And I believe that they would need the presence of Western troops from allied countries, if there were an agreement to have a ceasefire, kind of a line of confrontation, perhaps some kind of a buffer zone. I think you need a force in country, excuse me, that would be able to be a deterrent. Conquering or reconquering what is really Ukrainian territory, it's a different issue. And I don't think that realistically can be a near-term objective. And that I don't think it would be possible even to get really European support for such a nationwide counteroffensive to retake territory. But that's quite different from having Ukraine cede territory in a legal way, for which, of course, it would need to change its constitution. But to cede territory to Russia and say, no, this can be part, or Donbass, we recognize this as part, and Crimea as part of the Russian Federation, this just breaks so many international norms that we rely upon, the United States, as well as our allies, rely upon to deter and prevent future aggression that puts all of us in peril. So I can understand that the Ukrainians may be forced by military necessity to come to an agreement that would be ugly, but an agreement that would be practically necessary for a period of time, but not to cede large swaths of its territory permanently to a Russian aggressor. I just shiver at the implications this means for NATO allies bordering on Russia, to include Finland.
Thank you, Leo. I have two more questions in the chat, and we have about 3 minutes. So one has to do with Greenland and what the likely outcome of a negotiation on the purchase could be, what the benefits and the obligations would be for both US and Europe. That is the first question. And of course, the second question is whether Trump has done irreparable damage to the transatlantic relations. Deborah, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll answer both quickly. On the first, and I haven't listened to the speech, which is the executive in the United States does not control the purse strings, and neither do they control the private sector, despite all the influence of tech companies that's been discussed, et cetera. So therefore, the devil is in the details on the purchase. Even, using DOD funds, you need Congress. There's going to be a huge debate on that. And so, again, an executive order does not a Greenland purchase make, bottom line. And then in terms of irreparable damage, I would say in some aspects, probably yes, because though this administration will end, and it's unclear what's going to happen in the next, there will be the hangover and leftover fear that, even if, let's say, the Democratic side wins and whatever, there could be a flip back 4 years down the line, because this has happened twice. So it's no longer the exception in the US approach to, its global engagement, its alliances. It could happen on occasion again.
Villa, if I
Sure.
may,
Go ahead, Leo, very briefly.
yes, I agree totally with what Deborah has just said. But I've just learned, I believe, and others might consider this over the years, that maybe Trump says the quiet part out loud. And when he said in a New York Times interview, which people, if they haven't seen it, could read it online last month, that the only limits that he recognizes on his global power are his own morality and his mind. And later, when asked about Greenland, he said, well, it's important to him psychologically to have ownership. I think we're at the point that we should take what he says at face value.
Thank you, Leo, on that assessment. What I'll say about Greenland as well is Deborah's point is extremely important. The level of support for this in the United States is not high. And it would have to go through the motions of being approved by Congress if there were an American acquisition of this territory. So this is something to keep in mind once you follow all the debates on this question, which understandably currently are extremely heated, and there is this feeling of urgency. With that, like this administration one day, this webinar also has to end. I want to thank our audience. Thank you so much for the questions, and thank you especially to our expert panel, Maria, Deborah, Leo. Thank you once again for an enlightening discussion. And perhaps we will be back next year in the same format to discuss what happened in Trump's second year, which by the looks of it will be quite a bit. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon or morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.